I just want to state for the record that my name is Lauren Newlin, and I am interviewing Will Locke. We are in Hastings, Nebraska, and today's date is November 21st, 2017. So to start off, when and where were you born?
I was born in El Dorado, Kansas, which is Butler County, and the east half of the county was the Flint Hills, pasture cattle country, and the west half was wheat country, row crop country. And we lived in a little tiny house down by the creek on the family farm. It was an oil field house, and drafty and poorly made. I'm proud of those humble roots. My dad used to say the garage was built way better than the house. And we had a windmill and an outhouse.
So what was the reason for you moving out to Nebraska?
Well, remarkably, both my parents were raised on small farms. Very humble. Both went to small rural churches, but for some reason or other, unlike some others in the family, they wanted to get an education, so they went where they could afford to go, Butler County Community College, which is still in existence today, and they both were kind of leaders a little bit, and so they both were presidents, my mom of the YWCA group and my dad of the YMCA group. And so they had a meeting of the two groups to plan things. And my mom told me, and this was just a few years ago when she was in her upper 90s, you know, I looked across at that guy and I thought, wow, he's good looking. I want to meet him. And they did. And they dated and eventually got married. And then I was the firstborn, and our first years were in that pitiful house down by the creek. But they got an education. They wanted an education.
What were both of your parents' names and
Okay.
what were their majors?
Alice Lena Gefeller, Gfeller, Locke, then. And then Kenneth Raymond Locke. That was their names, and they just both wanted to learn, and they kind of wanted to get away from the farm a little bit. And so they got an education, and then my dad decided he wanted to be a minister, and his little country church was Presbyterian. My mom's was Methodist, but he went with Presbyterian and went after graduating from college. Then he went to seminary in Chicago. So then we moved to a little town in Lake Grove that he could pastor Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then take classes in Chicago at McCormick Theological Seminary, an urban seminary. And here's these two small farm kids.
Was farm life a big part of your family, like with your grandparents and everything?
Yeah. Well, you know, my parents were from what they call the greatest generation, the GI generation, born in the early part of the century, and their characteristics were hardworking, conscientious. You just worked. You worked all the time, and there wasn't such a thing as retirement. You worked till you couldn't work anymore. They survived World War I, the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, and then into World War II. And I was born in 1939, and so you might have a question later about that. And then my parents were a lot like both sets of grandparents in terms of God-fearing, work ethic, integrity, very religious, very conservative in terms of social things. That is, absolutely no drinking, no smoking, no gambling, no cards. I had to talk them in to Old Maid, which is matching up characters in books. I don't know if they would let me do that. Let's see. The big social stuff was at the church, or maybe we went to a square dance at the nearby school. Really conservative, but they wanted to get an education, and they did, and they traveled all over the world, and they were inclusive. Now, in that early, my grandparents, they didn't talk to me about GLBTQ. They didn't talk to me about civil rights. None of that. But my parents, as they went from church to church, always were pretty inclusive. They accepted immigrants. My mom, the GLBTQ thing wasn't even talked about very much, even in my youth. But when my mom was in her 90s, I mean, it was clear that she was pretty understanding and sympathetic. So they were relatively without prejudices, unless you want to say gambling.
Would you say, just with your parents going to different, like you said, churches, was it the stance of religion that made them more inclusive, you would think?
You know, today is amazing. We have mainline churches tend to be pretty inclusive, like the Presbyterian Church in the USA, Episcopal, Lutheran, ELCA, and I could go on up and down the list, are pretty inclusive, and they've worked it out so that gay people can be ordained, women can be ordained, and all that. But there's another side of, and I guess the term they usually say is either far right or conservative or evangelical, and some of those folks aren't as open. And so the whole gay thing, I mean, it's a sin. You're born in sin. Now, I just don't understand that. But I told you my mom and dad were a little bit different in their families in terms of leaving and getting educated and being more progressive and inclusive. There are some of my uncles and aunts who are not as interested in education or inclusiveness. And I'm just amazed. And I'm not, those uncles were good to me. I love, and I try to figure that out. Why did my mom and dad go kind of one way and some of their brothers and sisters not quite so much?
Were your parents in the family, were they the youngest, the oldest?
Oh, good. That's good. My dad was the oldest of three, and my mom was the middle of three. But, that's a good question.
Do you think that has to do with anything? I should think more about it.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure that out, but I'm still young yet. I have more time to figure. My dad was just a high energy, really smart guy, not sophisticated, grew up on a small farm. He was the guy who was president of Rotary and all, president of his seminary class, and kept the books. I mean, he was smart and a hard worker. And my mom was smart in a different way and a hard worker, but in those days, as strong as she was more of a support to my dad as he went from church to church to church. His first church was when he was in seminary in Indiana, very rural. First church then, after he was out of seminary, was Bennett, Nebraska, southeast of Lincoln, very small town. Next was Aurora. Next was Grand Island, and then finally Kansas City, Kansas. So each church was larger, and that's kind of the way ministers usually go. So I moved about every 5 years. So I had supervision and modeling from my grandparents, all four, from uncles and aunts, my mom and dad. And the congregations. I mean, think how lucky I was. I mean, if I would have become a lazy drunkard, I'd have disappointed all these people. There just was no way. And so that reminds me of Colin Kaepernick, the football player who kneeled during the... And I think, I'm an old white guy, gray beard. I had everything going for me. Everything going. Nobody's really hardly ever cheated me or put me down. If I worked hard, I could achieve what I wanted. So if I were a young black man, would I want to call attention to the injustice that my parents, uncles, aunts, extended family, others of my race, color? Yeah, I think I would. I'm not sure how I would do it, whether I would have done it the way. I think Colin Kaepernick will have a place in a chapter in the history books, even though he is judged. Depends on whether you judge as an old white guy or a young black man. So I try to understand. One of the things then, and my parents set the stage, is I've been very interested in Native American studies and have been lucky enough to know lots of Indian folks who were great models, very successful, hardworking, great writers, Pulitzer Prize writers. They've been here on N. Scott Momaday wrote Housemaid of Dawn, Pulitzer Prize winning novel, and he's been on our campus twice. An amazing person with a booming bass voice, would talk to anybody. So I just have to say, I was surrounded by people of that silent generation. Some are called the greatest generation. And I really think because of that such strong, I worked on the farm, as a kid. So, and I think I'm a lot like that. And that sounds like I'm bragging. I don't mean that. I just think it would have been hard for me to be way different. And so I've always been kind of a worker plodder. And that's fine. I still am. I still keep really busy. That silent generation, or that GI generation, they never retired. Farm folks didn't retire. They just worked till they were too sick to work.
And I was about to say, earlier you had mentioned that you moved around every 5 years. Did you see different diversities when you moved around from different cities?
Oh, that's what well, it was all in Nebraska. And so, born in 39, so in the 40s and the early 50s, K-12, not really very much diversity. And no discussion of a lot of civil rights issues that were to come, GLBTQ issues, women's rights, the Great Society, not much at all. I think we were a lot the same. We were all aware of socioeconomic classes, so doctors and business people dressed better, and I would have been in the middle, but as my parents being clergy, I was accepted really either way. And then there would have been people who didn't have nice shoes or nice clothes or good lunches. Did I answer the question?
Yes, you did.
The closest would have been Grand Island High School, where they had a pretty strong, and that was probably second generation Hispanic population. But they were pretty well integrated, second generation. I took Spanish, and there was a Hispanic student or two, and my instructor would often ask them about grammar and idioms and that sort of thing. So not much diversity. But, so I'm a student of history. I'm on the Adams County Historical Society, and very interested in Adams County history, Nebraska history, every history. Well, I rode a bike over a 2-year period, about 20 miles or so at a time, all seasons, on every road in Adams County. That's 993 the roads department tells me, plus out and back to the car, so lots of repetition. It was fascinating, but what I learned was the diversity in settling Adams County was remarkable. Keep track. French Canadian on East 12th. German Lutheran to the southeast. To the southwest, Holstein, Danish, like the Holstein cattle. And there's a Danish cemetery. And then a little further north is Wanda Lutheran, which is German Lutheran. And then just about 3 or 4 miles to the east is Assumption, which is German Catholic. And then Czech and Eastern European little groups. Think of that diversity. Well, yes, we have diversity today, but I'm not so sure it's any greater. There were all these languages and all these accents. And I think on 1st and 2nd Street in about 1872, when Hastings College was first discussed, probably there was more German spoken than English, and the English that was spoken, probably a lot of it was Scottish and Irish accents. Now, who ran the town? Probably more the English-speaking people. That's who started Hastings College, Presbyterians. My dad, the name is Locke, L-O-C-K-E. The other, my grandma, was Foster, and those are English or Scottish. And then my mother was Gefeller and Canals, which is German, but German-Swiss.
Do you think that Presbyterian played a huge role within your family?
Yes. Methodist and Presbyterian probably were among the two strong, and Lutheran and Catholic too, in settling. If you looked at all the little country churches in Adams County and then in Butler County where I was born, lots of Lutheran and Presbyterian and Methodist and then Roman Catholic. And missionaries went on west of here, the Whitmans, and they established colleges, a lot of them Presbyterian. The Presbyterians were really good at establishing colleges everywhere they went. And Hastings College is a good example of that. And by the way, in 1882, when we were chartered, and I read this in the minutes of the Board of Trustees, because I read the minutes for the first 10 or 20 years, every word, they really wanted women to be able to take classes. Now think about that. 1882. When did women's suffrage finally get passed? 1921. So I'm really proud of the tradition of Hastings College. And I think today, we are working hard to have support systems for everyone, including GLBTQ, including folks with roots in other cultures and countries. Not that we do enough, but I think a lot of people want to do this.
Mm-hmm. Would you say compared to when you first, because I know we talked about this earlier, how you went to Hastings College, what was the diversity in LGBTQ for you?
Let's see. Let me see if I can do both of those. Let me do LGBTQ. We didn't talk. It just wasn't discussed much. Now, yes, we were aware, and there were some jokes. And I wasn't raised that way. I'm so boring. I would walk away if somebody was telling jokes like that or say something. I didn't believe that was right. So there was some of that. But there wasn't such a thing as being out. And that would be true for high school as well. I played sports and music at Grand Island High School. And yeah, there were locker room jokes, but not much more than that. Now, did you make fun of somebody that you thought was acting feminine? I think so, yeah. But not everybody did that. There was just some of that. So there have always been bullies, but I noticed the big change as a school teacher I think in the 80s, there were several events. It was following the civil rights movement, women's suffrage. But in the 80s, it sort of reached into the public schools, and we started to learn about eating disorders and depression, and starting to have school counselors, and starting to listen to kids, and started to watch for bullying. Now, if you had fights on the playground, we would break that up in the 60s and 70s. But in the 80s, we started to think, okay, what's going on here? Is this bullying because of sexuality? Is bullying because of what? Of race or culture, like because you're Indian or whatever. So in the 80s is when I saw it in Hastings start to change, and people started to come out, and more in the 90s. And then by the millennials, it was just common. If you were struggling with sexuality, it was a lot easier to talk about it. I'm saying inclusive, a person could talk about it. And then, guess what? High school kids, they're not living in sin. They're just people. And so we started to look at people not as if they're gay or straight, but, are they honest? Can they be relied on? And they're just like people. And I think now people understand that there's a spectrum of sexuality, and people can be on more toward one end or the other, female or male, but also closer to the middle, and even be in the middle, unclear. And now even transgenders are coming out in the military. And I had a student in 7th grade who's a great tree person. He's so strong. She now, Brandy now. And she transgendered. And we can talk about it. He talks to me about it. And I said, well, when you were in 7th grade, what were things like? And he said, every day was hell. And I'm not so sure he was made fun of. For one thing, he was a pretty strong kid. And he was kind of quiet. So that's a big change. And if you're interested in the 60s and the 70s, not so much on sexuality. That started to come, I think, more in the 80s. Mental health, more in the 80s.
During the time you attended Hastings College, is this where you had met your wife at?
Yeah. I came in 1957.
Mm-hmm.
And Presbyterian College, lifelong Presbyterian minister. My younger brother, by the way, became a Presbyterian minister, and my brother-in-law is a Presbyterian minister. And in 57, let me say this. Most people here were pretty serious about it. Not a lot of goofing around. It didn't cost nearly as much. I had a small scholarship, and then I worked in the dining hall. And my folks didn't have to pay anything. I was able to do that. It's so much more. But we didn't have much either on campus. We didn't have computers and TVs. So in 1959 then, my wife came from Lincoln, a Presbyterian church, Presbyterian College, and we met fairly early in the dining hall. And I noticed her because she was smart and kind of bubbly personality, and we just started to talk, and I was a little more shy and reserved in this regard, and so she was real easy to be with.
What does she do?
She's a Hastings College alum,
Mm-hmm.
and she got 2 master's degrees from UNK in special education. So she taught kindergarten, and then went to work for the service unit, and she developed programs for young children, preschool children who had special needs. And she was more of an introvert, quieter, but brilliant at that. and she just worked out programs that are still in existence today, models for the state. She was brilliant, still is. Wonderful. Today she's helping seniors figure out their drug plans, which would, that Part D it's called, Medicare, and it helps seniors pay for their drug bills. So she's a counselor for that. So that's how we met. But we had a lot in common. The Presbyterian, interested in church. We both wanted to get our degrees. She was smarter, great memory, and I had to work harder. And both ways are good. I mean, I'm proud of my career. A lot of awards I didn't deserve. 1981 Nebraska Teacher of the Year, mostly because I hung in there with students. Just hung in there, wouldn't ever give up. So that goes back to my parents, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It just is. I thought about that since I was thinking about things to get ready for your questions. Yeah, but there are a lot of people like me. I eat breakfast. Let's say I did this morning with retired faculty, and quite a few of us at Hastings College are kind of like that.
So rewinding back, now that you're talking about being a professor, what had sparked your interest into becoming an education? Yep, a teacher.
You know, I could have been a farmer, but it wasn't possible. You know, I wasn't going to inherit a farm, couldn't afford a farm. I like people, love people, and that's from being in congregations where people would say, "Oh, do you play basketball? You're tall." Oh, yeah, blah, blah, blah. I just learned to like people and be interested in people. And then, this is so corny, but I'm an idealist, and I kind of wanted to make a difference. And so I became an education major and a history major. And then went to KU for my master's, which was a really good move because then I had educational psychology and stuff that most newer teachers didn't have. So I somehow was able to start programs and try new things, get students involved, do field trips, for example, do learning games, which is much more group work. I loved that. Loved junior high teaching. And it was all 7th and 8th grade, and people would say, "Well, how could you stand it?" I said, "They're spontaneous. They're funny. Just keep them busy and doing things. You don't ever say, okay, now you have some free time." And then I did outdoor ed, and then I did Oregon Trail trips where we camped along the trail all the way to Wyoming. I was a scoutmaster, led groups. In fact, it was the scoutmastering that helped me figure out to do field trips for my school work, because I thought, God, they don't ever forget anything when we go on a camp out and go on a backpack and climb a mountain. They remember it all. Why am I not doing this with my school students? So that's what I started to do. Started an outdoor education program, for example. Then I did Outward Bound, I think in 1981, Colorado Outward Bound. You can look that up. Started during World War II in Great Britain. And the idea of Outward Bound, there's a strong Colorado component, and I got in that. And so for 21 days, and the instructors were brilliant. Lucy Buckley, who had been a PE teacher in the Denver public schools and then became human resources for a company, and she was brilliant. She pushed us. And so part of being a teacher, maybe I'm recruiting you, is to learn who the person is. And it starts with the eyes. Lucy knew she could push me and I'd do my best. She just knew that. She made me take an ice axe and go sliding down a snowfield with a cliff at the end. And she knew I'd remember how to roll over and dig the pick in and lay across the shaft and stop in time. So that's what a teacher does. And you get paid all right. It isn't enough to attract some people. The payoff is the making a difference. I learned a lot from Outward Bound about group work and challenges. Gifted lazy were the toughest because teachers would give up on them. I never gave up. Never gave up. And so whenever I see a former student who tried to manipulate me, they'll always say, yeah, you wouldn't give up on me, which is high praise.
Who would you say inspired you or kind of pushed you to be the most to be in this field, like extended family, teachers?
Yeah. That's really, thank you. That is so easy. Well, first of all, my mother and father, and they were different. They had different kinds of intelligence and personality, so I got stuff from both of them. My two aunts who never married, they were school teachers, who gave me National Geographic when I was about 6 and bored. And then when I was 8 or 9 and bored, they gave me Hemingway, Old Man in the Sea, and The Snows of Kilimanjaro, which are novelettes, and by the way, they were made into movies. And then I've always loved Hemingway, always loved National Geographic. All of my grandparents and uncles and aunts, I learned from them also. And people aren't perfect. Sometimes they say something, and if somebody said something, my grandpa said something about a rock, that's a nigger's toe. I was horrified. Oh, why did you say that? And he didn't really have an answer. That's just what that rock was called. And I said, oh. And so he could tell I was shocked by that. Mm-hmm. But, I still admire all of them and love them. So that's it. Now, high school. I could name tons of coaches and teachers, but the one who had the biggest influence and helped me come to Hastings College was my Grand Island High School band and orchestra teacher, Paul Sell, S-E-L-L. He was a violin player. That's pretty unusual. Mostly band teachers are instruments other than strings. And he never smiled. He didn't crack jokes much. He just was superbly poised and talented. I just worshiped him. So he said, well, I think you should try out for All-State, band or orchestra. I really think it should be orchestra because I think you'll have a better chance. And I did and got in. And now, Saturday night, I attended the third generation from me of All-State. My grandson, Eric Freeling, whose mom and dad went here too, my daughter and now my son-in-law. So all three of my children were in All-State orchestra or choir. And then, so I was the first one, then all three of my children, and now Eric Freeling. 3 generations in All-State. And that was huge because you're part of something really, really good. Mm-hmm. You are pushed. The people around you are at least as good as you are, probably better, so you have to be better. So that's a hero. Then Hastings College. Do you mind if I say Hastings College then?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Going on and on.
You're all good.
Jimmy King was my advisor. He was the band director. A wonderful person. A lot of personality. He probably didn't push us hard enough. But if we got out, but that's been an influence on me. If the shoe fits, wear it. So I know you didn't all screw up, but those of you who did, shape up. Mm-hmm. Still think about him. And then I had another person, Darrell McFerrin, was history professor, and he never got his doctorate. But that never bothered me because he was incredibly intelligent, had a great physique, had probably been an athlete and kept in shape, a wonderful lecturer with a few questions thrown in, and such great character. And the reason he didn't get his doctorate, I don't know. It didn't matter. Then, Hastings Public Schools, my first principal, I always tell my student teachers, when you go to interview in a school, size up that principal man or woman, you want to make sure they're going to pay attention to you and push you but support you. And that's what my first one did. Merle Hemingway was his name. He went on to head up the graduate education program at CU Boulder, which is a very influential position, and his son went on to be chancellor of KU, University of Kansas. So that's some pretty good people.
Oh, yeah.
Then, try not to make this go too much longer, but my first pastor here was a fellow named Cy Kessler at First Presbyterian Church. He became the head of the whole Presbyterian Church in the USA, traveled all over the world. He was, president of our General Assembly. That's not quite the right. He was terrific. And he talked me into running for session 3 times. He made me, and I'm not an accountant, but be head of the fundraising, the budget, which is really important. And somehow he knew that I'd work hard at it. I wasn't talented at it, but I worked hard. And we raised the budget 6.5%.
Oh, wow.
One of the biggest ever, but it was just because a lot of organization and then people went out and did stuff. And of course, that's still going on. I mean, there's Dwayne Strassheim, a former professor here, and Dean. Darrell Lloyd. I took an institute with Hastings College professors in 1967. It was brilliant. So I owe so much to Hastings College.
Not only were you an education teacher, but you also are very involved with community work and environmentalism. How did you start becoming involved with both of those? Like when around the time frame?
You know, I have to go back a second. I made the change to teach college. That's pretty significant because Dwayne Strassheim asked me to teach a class for Hastings College. And in it were Hastings College students. One of them was Bill Gavers, our basketball coach.
Oh.
And it was teaching those who wanted to be social studies teachers. So we met in my classroom at the junior high. They were awesome. And I thought, gee, this is so good. But I ought to get my doctorate if I'm going to be teaching college students. So I did. And my hero, Al Kilgore, on chair of my doctoral committee. What a great committee. I just put one step in front of the other and made the list of what all I had to do, and I earned it. And I'm not a genius. Okay, and then I came to Hastings College, and what a gift. I've just loved it, working with education students and history students. Okay, now back to your question is, environmental, should I do that one first?
Sure.
Well, that goes back to my grandparents. Both of them planted trees, and this was in the 40s. After the Dust Bowl, they both did. Now, not everybody planted trees. They were small, poor farmers. They made terraces. They grassed waterways. Well, if you grass a waterway, you don't grow a crop on it. You just keep the soil from eroding. They were poor. I don't see very many grassed waterways or terraces in Adams County. Now, one of the reasons is we have these huge combines, and so if they can't really negotiate a terrace and maybe not a grassed waterway. I'm still asking about that. So they showed me with pride the tree, the little kid. And then my dad planted trees, and I helped him. And then when I was a scoutmaster, we planted trees all around the town of Hastings. And then we'd usually do a service project when I took my classes on the Oregon Trail, and then teachers later, and students, and retired people, and astrophysicists, and PhDs. We'd always do service, and a lot of times it was planting a tree or making check dams where it was eroding in the desert. And that all goes back to my forebears. Plus, it's in the Bible, I think, Christian stewardship of the land. It seems really clear to me. So there are those same influential themes again. You know, how lucky can a guy be? And to meet my wife, to be how lucky. and to be able to associate with teachers and church people and the Hastings College community and around awesome students. And then when I came here, I worked 60, 70 hours a week like everybody does around here, except students more, and didn't do too much with trees. But then when I retired, then that's the first thing I started to do. So I do about, here on campus, maybe 200, 250 hours a year of just volunteer work. It's fun, and it probably does good. A lot of it's with students. We're a Tree Campus USA, and I pushed that application, and I'm so proud that our students and staff and faculty contribute something like 700 or 800 hours of volunteer work a year, which is as much, probably more than UNL, and as much, about the same as Vanderbilt, which has a great arboretum and is kind of a big tree campus.
Do you do it also just in Hastings, or do you do it in other communities as well to help volunteer?
Yeah. Well, I'm a member of, I'm Master Gardener, so the Highland Park Arboretum, south of the museum.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sort of the oak guy, and when we give talks and programs, I do the oaks. That's the history. Oaks are the history of civilization, by the way. And then here, and then I'm not really active in Scouts now, although I give tours to Scouts and so forth. Probably a little bit here and there around the state, but mostly here. Yeah. And then let's see, was the other part of your question service?
Yeah, like community service,
yeah.
or if you were part of any community.
Okay. Now, can I take a minute on this and go through the steps? So my grandparents, they just worked all the time. Their service was to paint the church, mow the cemetery, help their neighbor who was sick. That's what they did. They probably crocheted stuff and sent stuff to children in need. Then my mom and dad were in churches where they did a lot more. There's a program in Africa where you pay for a heifer that becomes a cow that gives milk and has offspring, calves, and so the herd grows. Jeannie and I, when we were at KU, when I graduated, we were going to go into the Peace Corps while we were young, and then we suffered a miscarriage.
Mm-hmm.
And it was pretty early, but still that was tough, and we just didn't feel like we could go overseas after that. So I came back to teach here, and Jeannie then did her senior year here at Hastings College. Okay. Okay. In high school, we didn't do much service that I remember. Church work, sometimes we did service. Like, Dad took a bunch of us high school kids from Grand Island up into the Sandhills, and we had ranchers camp meetings because it was so far to drive for church. And so we'd have a few days, and they'd camp, the ranchers would,
mm-hmm.
and we'd serve food. So that's what we did. We served food to them. So that was service, but more with church. Then Scouts. I became Scoutmaster, and Scouts do service by the ton. And I liked that. And then we started to do a little bit more in the schools. And then in the 90s, we started to do service at Hastings College. And I would say one of the biggest cultural changes in the Hastings College cultural was in the 90s when we started to promote service. I'm putting you to sleep here.
Oh, no.
Service. And I'm just in awe of the service. I mean, packing food, taking care of trees, pulling weeds, going around door to door to collect food. Way, way, way more than my college years. We pretty much were nose to the grindstone in the late 50s and early 60s. Now you're nose to the grindstone, but you're very service oriented. I think this, you hear a lot of criticism of youth. Don't buy it. I don't buy it at all. K-12, they do more service. The discipline, it's different now. Kids are mostly the same, but there are some socioeconomic issues. If there's more divorce now, so a lot of single parent families. I don't know if you have questions on that. I could talk about that. But kids, if you keep them busy and try to keep them excited, and they know you're doing your darn best for them, they'll do pretty good for you. I'm out there with student teachers. I don't. What I see is very positive and very good. I mean that. And I would say the majority of people, I've been around so long, they say, oh, kids are really different today, aren't they? And I'll say, yeah, there's some different. They're mostly the same. They do more service today. They're in more activities. Better than my generation. They're shocked.
Would you say that there was a lot of little or none of your service work when you went to Hastings College?
I don't remember doing much service. I just don't. I started the band at St. Cecilia's because I was a music major, and Jimmy King got me that job. It was a great part-time job, but I got paid, so that really wasn't service. I don't remember doing much service. I really don't remember any. We must have done some.
But yeah, transitioning over
Okay.
to the movement questions.
Oh, good.
When you were a student, you said that you had obviously attended Hastings College. What was it like on campus during the time of the Vietnam War?
And I've thought about that. And we were aware. First of all, Korean War was winding down, and when I was a freshman and sophomore, there were people in my class a couple of years older who had been, if not in Korea, had at least enlisted because of the Korean War. Then there was a gap right during my area before the Vietnamese War really cranked up. So we were pretty aware of the Korean War. We read stuff, what was going on in Vietnam. I remember reading about the French at Dien Bien Phu. They were surrounded and annihilated. And that's one of the reasons we started to think about going in there, because we couldn't see Southeast Asia becoming communist. And there was all this talk about the domino effect, falling domino. So if North Vietnam goes, then South Vietnam, then Cambodia, then Thailand, and it just will go on and on and on. So that's what we heard about, but not very many people were recruited or drafted then, none drafted. I went to see the treasurer as a sophomore and said, should I enlist and get that done? He said, no way. Sputnik went off in 1957, huge influence. And the National Defense Education Act was passed, and they wanted teachers. And so I got a $100 scholarship every semester. That was a lot. And I didn't have to pay it back as long as I taught. And so there was an incentive in my time to go ahead and be a teacher. Was there much? Why don't I stay with my college years a little bit? Is that okay?
Yeah, so
late 50s, early 60s. Women's lib a little bit, but my mom was strong, my grandmas were strong, my wife was strong and talented, a career woman. I was lucky enough to be on board from the very beginning. And Ginny and I, most of our career earned about the same, and which I was always very proud of. Okay, women's lib. Not much on. Oh, I've got a story. Civil rights, not a lot, but we were aware. And then later on there was Selma, Alabama, and the bus boycott, and what was her name? The lady who wouldn't.
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks, yeah. And there's Rosa Parks Way on a street in Lincoln. And then Woodstock. And I was even aware of Woodstock. we didn't. I don't remember ever any demonstrations or even posters or billboards, but we were aware and paying attention, and the seeds were planted. But I remember we had not very many African American students, but some. Some of them were in sports. And I remember we were talking, I don't know, in the student union, and this thing, barbershops came up. And the black kids said, this one Liberty barbershop won't cut our hair. I said, why not? They said, well, we don't have the right tools. We don't know how to cut your hair. We don't have the right equipment. I was shocked. So there was, on campus, everybody really pretty much got along. If there was a neo-Nazi, I didn't know it. There probably were some with that tendency. If there was a white supremacist, and there probably were a few, but they weren't out in the open.
Yeah.
We kind of got along. And so I went to that barber shop and I said, is this true? And they gave me that same answer, and I said, well, I'm not coming here anymore. So I went to a different barber shop. That's not much.
We're going on to that barbershop comment. Was Hastings ever segregated into little groups, like how they were talking?
A great question. And I have an answer. When I started teaching in 1962, 7th and 8th grade, there were several active, almost prominent African American families. The Smiths were one, the Mullins, and it might have been a carryover from the Naval Ammunition Depot days, a generation earlier. I taught them, coached them, and then there were some American Indian families, Black Bonnet. Mm-hmm. But when I would go around in my classes and say, introduce yourself and say a little bit about yourself, they'd never talk about their blackness or their black culture or heritage or their Indian. Black Bonnet. And they wouldn't say anything. Their name is Black Bonnet, and everybody knows it. They wouldn't say a thing about there being Lakota. Mm-hmm. Okay, now, they were scattered. Probably, we didn't have Locklin, but probably not in the wealthier new house part of town. Maybe scattered in middle class, lower class. But the diversity thing I talked about earlier, when this county was settled, so there were Germans from Russia in southeast, south of us, south of the tracks, and then German Lutherans in the southwest, toward Brickyard, and there's still those old churches there. And you know what? One group was Catholic. Oh, and then there were Catholic Germans. Those three groups didn't speak to each other. You didn't date. Protestants and Catholics. So see, as we're a mess. Remember the movie A River Runs Through It? Mm-hmm. Written by the son of a Presbyterian minister who was a lot like my dad, kind of severe, straight arrow type. And a river runs through it, the creation of God. And the opening of that book starts out, man by nature is a damn mess. And I'm an optimist, but I'm certainly willing to say we're a mess, all of us. And look what's on in the front lines, headlines today. The sexual harassment, assault, all coming out, people in power taking advantage of that power. And when did we get women's right to vote? 1921, for God's sakes. So it's a journey, though. I'm still an optimist. And trying to understand the Bible, I don't have it figured out. It's a journey. So we had discrimination all through our history here. It was pretty much kept quiet. During the NAD years, they brought in everybody they could find who would come here to work out there, and that means black Navy, because they wouldn't let blacks on ships, and Indians who lived north of the high school in teepees in the winter. Everybody, and imagine what a shock it would be to come from inner city, what we'd call inner city today, I don't know if they called it that in the 40s, and live here and work, and the kids go to school here. It was brutal. It was just such a shock, and I could go into that. Okay.
I know you said that there wasn't much like activism on campus, but did you see any movements, like any little movements at least on campus?
Awareness, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And some people more aware, and I would put myself in the awareness category. But did I demonstrate? Did I make signs? Did I make signs with Martin Luther King Jr. quotes? No. Okay. When I was a young teacher, just struggling to learn how to teach in the 60s and early 70s, I always had current events on Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we could talk about civil rights. It was far enough away from us. And I always brought out both sides and say, okay, we have to have somebody talk about the other side or the third side or the fourth side. There was one topic we couldn't talk about. Do you know what it was? Vietnam. Why? Because the kids are sitting there and they're looking at each other. And some families had brothers who went to Canada and some who were drafted or enlisted. You just couldn't talk about it because it was just too raw. Mm-hmm. Later on then, the topic was GLBTQ, although at first I don't think we had all those letters. We didn't understand it well enough. You couldn't really talk about that either. Now, my wife and I left here in 1961, got married. I worked that summer and started KU in the fall for my master's, which was a really good move. So we sang in the choir of my dad's church, Ginny and I did. The neighborhood was changing in Kansas City, Kansas. Do you understand how that worked? White people, black people moved in, white people moved out. So this was an all-white church, good people. But as the neighborhood changed, our congregation moved out, they kept coming back. So some of us, including Ginny and me, said, okay, Vacation Bible School, should we invite the neighborhood? Mm-hmm. And we did. We walked around the blocks. I think we went out 4 blocks and put flyers inviting them. And a few black children came. But that began the integration of that church. And eventually it was integrated and they alternated white pastor, then a black pastor, then a white. But eventually it ceased to exist. I don't exactly know why, and there's a tree growing through the roof now. So Ginny and I were activists through my dad's church in Kansas City, Kansas. Wow. But as far as I know, nothing like that here, other than in schools and on sports teams and here, most people kind of got along. Mm-hmm. Now, what about dating? It was uncommon, but not unheard of. I don't think Hastings College student body would have been too bent out of shape if in mixed race dating. Mm-hmm. And as far as I know, I didn't know anybody who came out in the 60s and 70s. That started, I think, in the 80s. So that might be helpful to you.
Speaking back onto the Vietnam War, where you said that was a sensitive topic because either families moved to Canada or being in the war, were you ever drafted or listed to go into the war?
No, and let's go back to what I said a little bit ago. Between my freshman and sophomore year, I went to talk to the business manager, and I said, should I go ahead and enlist and just get it out of the way in case I would be drafted? And he said no. Now, as I thought, and I took his word, as I thought back, I thought, well, of course he needs students in school. But he said, the National Defense Education Act, you're a teacher, you're going to get it. They want you to be a teacher and go teach, and you've got this scholarship, $100 a semester. So no. And I was in between the Korean War and the Vietnamese War. Now, am I proud that I didn't serve? No. Sometimes I look back and think, I could have, maybe I should have served. I really do have mixed feelings and a little bit of guilt. Mostly not, because I've been a teacher all my life and made a difference that way. And I really did answer the national call, the National Defense Education Act. Good question. Follow up. Push me on that if you want to.
I know we talked a lot about the Vietnam War during classes and how people during that generation had mixed feelings. What were your thoughts about the Vietnam War?
Yeah. Mixed. So if you'll have to listen to all this, it'll be so long. But, there's some key things in there that as I talk to you now, I think, oh, wow, circle that one, mixed. And, on a lot of these controversial issues, you start out, you're mixed and you try to sort it out. Like this tax plan. Mm-hmm. I don't have all the answers. I know they're proposing some things that I don't think are right, but how should we do tax? I'm not sure I can figure that out. Okay. Mixed. Here's why. My teaching partner and dear friend, her son went to Canada. Ginny's cousin, a year or two younger, went to Vietnam. So every family's extended family and friends had this split. It was very, very tough. We didn't have any great family schisms on this. I think my dad, he might have been close to being a pacifist. I saw in his files, he kept everything. I don't know, 9 file cabinets, and I had to go through everything. I found a letter where he was starting the process to become a chaplain. And that would have been in World War II, by the way. And he had children and all that, and they just never drafted him. Mixed. I think that would apply to a lot of people. I think we were influenced by the domino effect strategy. McNamara was the Secretary of Defense, and he was a whiz kid, brainy, crunched the numbers. And now we look back. The French did it. Dien Bien Phu were wiped out, encircled and wiped out in this little valley. And then we lost that war. Mm-hmm. We lost it. There's no two ways about it. Tom Cruise in the 4th of July, the movie, brought it out pretty good, what it did to people. And, people who served and sacrificed and were wounded came back home and were mistreated. That wasn't right. So a lot of mix. Were we right to go to Vietnam? Now we can look back. I don't think very many people would say that we were right. And now Iraq, supposed to be weapons of mass destruction, never found them, and it opened the way up for Iran to have a lot more influence. It messed up destabilized the whole Middle East. Was that right? And I was mixed on that one too, because weapons of mass destruction, and the Secretary of Defense was Colin Powell, who I admired tremendously. Everybody did. And he was wrong, and he admitted it.
Did you think that one president could have done better, or is there someone that you thought did well?
What a great... You've been studying this, yeah. Oh, I'm so pleased. Thank you so much. This is wonderful for me. Boring for you and wonderful for me. Okay. Several presidents had a hand in this. So, Truman. I knew Harry Truman, liked him. Not just because he was a Democrat, but he made a decision. Eisenhower, one of my favorite presidents. The interstate system called attention to the warfare state, all the employment by making tanks and guns, not right. That was a Republican president, Eisenhower. Then Kennedy. And the whole Kennedy-Nixon thing was very tough around here because Kennedy was a Catholic. I'm ashamed to admit that. In the 60s, that was an issue still. Remember I said at the beginning of our county, the Germans from Russia in the around 1900, 1890s, and then the Catholic Germans and the Protestant Germans didn't get along? Well, that Catholic thing, and actually you still see some tension, and that's too bad. I was lucky enough to start the band at St. Cecilia's, and they were great to me. I loved it. And they knew my dad was president and minister, and we just all joked about it. So, Nixon. Then LBJ, or Kennedy. Now, Kennedy didn't have a lot of answers either, but it was a creep thing, mission creep. And Kennedy died way too young. But he really had a lot of trouble figuring out what to do with Vietnam. He wasn't clear on that. Is that what you've heard in class?
Yes.
Yeah. That's the way I remember it. And then, so it was left for LBJ, and there he was. And he was very mixed on this, I think. But what's he supposed to do? Admit defeat? How could he do that? How could he do that? And yet, he was a smart guy. He started out as a high school social studies teacher, history teacher in Texas. And he was so skilled. We have to come back to LBG and all the legislation that he got through. So, but he knew I think he knew we weren't going to win. And then, is he the one who didn't run for a second term?
LBJ, yes.
Yeah. And that's why. So, I don't have much more to say except what a mess. And all the lives. And, a lot of things we keep coming back to try to solve. And right now, what we're doing in Charlottesville and with the president and some of his appointees and Roy Moore, we're coming back to women's suffrage. We're coming back to civil rights. We're coming back to the Cold War, now that Putin is more aggressive. We're revisiting all the Civil War, not civil rights, also the Civil War. We're right back to that, trying to still figure it out. Woodstock. You haven't asked me about that.
Yes, that was my next question.
Was I at Woodstock?
Yes.
Are you kidding? But I was aware of it, but did I pay a lot of attention? No. But we just visited Woodstock with the Hastings College group with Robin Kuzier.
Oh my God.
And there's a big education cultural center there now, and we visited the field. I could show you pictures. They expected maybe several tens of thousands to come, or 100,000, and over 450,000 came. Wow. And the cars, there was no place to park, so they had to park beside the road, and then there was no more room, and so they filled the road. So the line of the road was a parking lot for 7 miles. Wow. And they walked in with their tents or tarps. Not enough food, not enough medical care. The 2 guys who showed us around were there.
Oh, really?
So we have all, now, what have you heard about Woodstock?
Just how, unlike other things, like, I know we just got done talking about, like, the Hells Angels and that whole massacre that happened. Unlike, that was what we've been talking about, and I know also just, like, all the different artists and how...
Yeah? Did you name them?
Bob Dylan, Janis Joplin.
Well, if you'd have asked me before I made this trip, I probably maybe could have said Bob Dylan, who got there at the end.
Yeah.
The very end. Sunday night or Monday night or something. I couldn't have named probably any others but him, because I was in our symphony. I was classically trained. I'm listening to Mahler and Stravinsky and Copland, not paying much attention to this other, but was aware of it. And the press, they're looking for stuff that makes news. So the marijuana and the alcohol and the free love, that was all highlighted, and that would have been my impression. But these 2 guys both said, just white college kids getting sunburned. Yeah, they said some smoke joints, some drank. Yeah, there was some making out and all that, but it was mostly just huge numbers of white college kids there for the music, and then they got sunburned because the first 2 days it was sunny and then it turned rainy.
What was the big difference that you saw between going to Woodstock and then in Hastings?
Okay.
If there was any difference.
Was there alcohol? Okay. Yes. On the Hastings College campus, in my time, there was a lot of drinking. Not everyone.
Mm-hmm.
My roommate drank and smoked heavily. It was an issue. And when I first came back here to start teaching in 1962 after my master's degree, one of the school board members who saw me as a new teacher and who was a doctor, his name was Clyde Klager, I think, he took me aside and he said, Will, you know, you're going to hear about drugs and all that, but by far and away the biggest problem for our young people in Hastings is alcohol, booze, period. I think that's still true, even though we have a wider array and we're hearing about opiates, and marijuana and all that. Our biggest problem that damages lives, I think, is still alcohol. And I think that's true on campus, but I'm not an expert. One thing, nobody talked much about the drinking. If somebody got arrested or had a party and cars chewed up somebody's pasture, that probably made the paper. Mm-hmm. And probably people in the community knew that Hastings College trained kids would go out and party and drink. Now we try to have the parties close, even in my neighborhood on East 7th, and I don't have any problem with that. I don't want you to hurt your life by drinking, but if you want to drink some and play games and be with your friends, do it next door to me. It's fine with me. It's probably not going to be that noisy. I don't want you hurting yourself. I don't want you driving and crashing, because we saw a lot of that. Mm-hmm. More stuff is being done. I'm motioning to the campus over there at the Union to try to help support lots of groups, and one of them is you know all the names. Mm-hmm. What are they called? 5-0 is one.
Oh, 5-0 Care, Bacchus.
Yeah, all that. So at least there's an effort, and the administration is not just trying to sweep it under the rug.
While you were in your time in Woodstock, what were your thoughts while you were there?
Which time exactly? You mean during college?
Yeah, during college.
About?
Just the concert and stuff in general, when you were there.
About what in general?
Like Woodstock.
Oh, Woodstock. Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry. No, that's my fault. You know, I think we were aware of it. It was really interesting. That's, I think, where the phrase hippie started to come into vocabulary in rural areas of the country. We didn't think a lot about it. Mm-hmm. First good spring day, did people go out and drink and get sunburned? Sure. That's not quite the same as Woodstock. Did we have Bob Dylan here? No. In fact, I didn't pay much attention, but remember, one of my majors was music, to all those folk singers. But Ginny and I, in our early married years, Peter, Paul, and Mary, loved John Denver. But remember, I was trying to survive as a young teacher. We were raising our kids, and I was playing in the symphony, and my main interest was classical music, and then later on and some folk music, and then we added jazz, and then finally it took a foreign exchange student from Argentina who went to school here then, Marcelo Jose Casanove, to teach us about the Beatles. I'm sure I knew about it, but did I care? Now they're among my favorites. My gosh.
I listened to a little bit of them.
You know, there's a lot of social stuff in these people.
Mm-hmm.
That's what brings me to them now. So I go to YouTube and I can call up all that stuff. And the trip to Woodstock, yeah.
Would you say that many of the artists, like Bob Dylan and like all those during the 60s, because I know a lot of their songs had meaning towards like the war, like politics, would you say any of them had a huge, like the lyrics had a huge influence on you or brought out awareness to like the campus?
As I said, and there would have been a lot of people much more tuned in to contemporary music and Elvis Presley and the Beatles and all that, but I was a straight arrow music major, classical music. But Ginny, my wife, I don't think she listened much to Elvis Presley or Bob Dylan. Now we do, but it was Brahms and Mahler and Stravinsky and Copland and Gershwin, American in Paris. Oh, we love those. But yeah, now we do more. You're never old to have another happy childhood. We can circle that one too. That's my favorite. Never too old to have yet one more happy childhood. And for me, looking back at all this stuff with my grandchildren is huge.
So this is kind of off topic, but Dr. Marino had told me, and I know you mentioned it earlier, that you cite a lot about Native American culture. Tell me a little bit more about that. If there was, I know we were talking about Wounded Knee and everything, but from you being in education, are you able to tell me a little bit more about what happened during the time frame with Native Americans?
Well, I don't remember in my growing up big Native American events. They were always kind of invisible. We're aware that we got women's suffrage cranked up finally, and we got civil rights and Rosa Parks going. And then eventually, finally, GLBTQ. But there was never a wave, even though there were Native American militants, and they took over Wounded Knee. And I do remember that. I didn't have a temptation to go up there and camp with them. I had my kids, my job. I was just kind of loyal to all that stuff and devoted. But if I would have been, like I said earlier, a young black man, Colin Kaepernick, I would have been trying to figure out some way to call attention to the injustice. Well, if I'd have been a young Lakota or Ponca, Lakota were among the more militant, I would have, or Kiowa, I would have pretty sure been aware of the injustices. And I probably would have been at Wounded Knee.
Out of all the
what a
cultures,
good question that is. That really puts me on the spot. I haven't quite thought that deeply about Wounded Knee. Now, but something stuck. Maybe it was my students. I had one or two students named Black Bonnet, and they were wonderful kids, but didn't want to talk about their cultures. So whenever I did Oregon Trail or Lewis and Clark, I was always careful to try to bring in native speakers. And I'd call around, and we didn't have email in the early years, and later on I could use email and find a good speaker. And that would be Bruley Sioux, that would be Nez Perce, that would be Ponca, and they were always good. So, as I think I said earlier, I was so lucky to be around successful tribal people. And so, for me, all this ugh, you squaw, you cook, all that Hollywood stereotypical stuff, the drunken Indian and all that, that just wasn't my picture. And it was, though, very common. When I did outdoor ed over at Camp Augustine on the Platte River, pointing over there, 15 miles, we'd start our walk-through time in the teepee. And that's what the boys would start to do. It was just would make you want to vomit. that Hollywood or all the stereotypes. And the girls didn't know what to think about it. I mean, they didn't know. So I wrote out a role play. And they did the role play the right way, which is the women had more power than the men, except for the actual fighting off the other tribes or whatever. And so that's always been important to me. And now I'm lucky enough to be on the state committee to help the Chief Standing Bear Trail become a National Historic Trail. And I think it will be, but probably not in my lifetime, even if I live a while longer. But you know, I did get to ride a bike on that trail over a 2-year period and see where they camped, which place is so important. Like being at Woodstock and seeing it. I wouldn't be surprised but what you go there sometime, inspired by Michelle and Marino or something. Go to these places. Go to Wounded Knee. Go to the campsites of Lewis and Clark. And go to the northwest of Kennesaw, the Lone Grave, where Susan Hale was married, leaving her husband with 2 kids to go back to Nebraska City and wheelbarrow a stone back to mark the grave. And now there's still a stone there. It's not the same one. Well, good job, because you got me going on that. If that's what you're trying to do, you've had some really good questions, better than I've ever had.
This is just because
Okay.
I always so I'm with you. I love learning about the Native American culture. What has sparked your interest in learning about them rather than different cultures or races?
Oh, well, I hope I'm interested in more than in many cultures, because in Adams County, French Canadian. I mean, who, if in a multiple choice, in a test, how many people who live in Hastings and Adams County can say French Canadian? Nobody has ever said that to me. I found that stone out there east and then researched it. So I hope it's more than just Lakota or Ponca. Oh, I had a member of my doctoral committee who was Cheyenne, Webster Robbins. I might have mentioned that. And he was terrific. But you know what he taught? It was on multicultural. But you know what? This is so interesting. The paper I wrote on was the Mennonites. Now, why is that important? Because Cherokee Indian, is not making us all write about tribes. He's writing about unique, special groups. And it's not just color of skin, it's more than that. So, and I think it has to do with my mother and father, who, even though we didn't talk about GLBTQ, I remember my dad married and divorced a couple that had both been divorced. And in the early 50s, that wasn't, a lot of ministers wouldn't do that, and he did. And he was right. And he hadn't always believed that way. I'm sure he grew up in that little country church thinking divorce was wrong, because that was his generation. And so, you know, the boomers, that all started to change. And you haven't asked me yet, but don't forget about LBJ agonizing over Vietnam. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Great Society, the war on poverty, Social Security, and we were aware of that. It was amazing. But what's going on now during the Trump administration is walking a lot of that back. Now, it depends on whether you're talking about moderate Republicans or way far right, Roy Moore Republicans. The moderate Republicans, actually Nixon carried on some of this from Kennedy. So we just, and we're, okay, so right now, going back to the Civil War, going back to the Civil Rights Act, now, and we're going back to the Great Society. All that is being revisited now. And Obama worked at it, but because he didn't have enough votes in Congress, he didn't get a lot of legislation passed. He did a lot by executive, and then Trump has just walked all that back. And the Republicans with their tax plan are walking all that back. And like my aunt, who's 97, I think I told you this the other day, sold a little farm to pay for her nursing home care. Let's see, the House plan wants to take away the medical deduction for her getting all that medical care in the nursing home. Now why? See, that's walking back the Great Society. And before that, they were walking back FDR, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's going on now, though, that's different is when I was in my 20s, I read Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And Adolf Hitler, very smart guy, but he didn't talk all the time. He didn't tweet. But he scapegoated the Jews.
Mm-hmm.
And do you know who else he scapegoated?
It was Polish.
Next, though, I think was the Roma, the Gypsies.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eastern Europeans, especially the Poles. Now, it was first the Jews in there. It was a hierarchy. Yes, scapegoating. And then the next thing he did was basically take over the press. It wasn't a free press. I mean, in the 30s, Germany was a republic. And he was able to do away with it and take it over. Now, what has just happened? Who are we scapegoating now? What cultural groups?
Asian cultural group.
Well, I would say Mexican.
Mm-hmm.
Today.
Yeah. Today. My bad. Sorry,
today,
they were talking about
Mexican and Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And now you can see more and more like black athletes and blacks, but that's down the list a little ways. But Hitler in his early years was way quieter about it, as is Vladimir Putin. Very smart guy, Putin. Very, very smart. I think the smartest on the world stage. And he just has been playing around with, I think, our president because of money. I'm sorry to be political. But the point I'm trying to make is we revisit these big issues. Mm-hmm. And that may not be all bad. Perhaps the very troubling things now, in my opinion, which are so good for whatever it is, 25 or 30% that still supports the president, and perhaps that will rally the moderate Republicans and the moderate Democrats, and we'll come back, and we'll have another wave that way, and then back and forth, and you'll get to look at it every 20 years.
So coming back to present day questions, when did you retire?
Yes, 2006, and I was 67. And I wasn't burned out. I had asked Rich Lloyd, the dean, I mean, do you need me to kind of move on? Mm-hmm. He said, no, I want you to teach as long as you want to. So that was very nice of him to say that. But the chair of the department, my dear friend Fred Condas, was also 67, 3 weeks older, I always tell him. And he was wanting to retire, so we worked it out that we'd both retire and each then teach half-time the next year. It was terrific. So I've taught part-time every year since. This falls the least with just a few student teachers. But I'm going to be 79 in the spring. I don't know how the student teachers are able to put up with me. I do try to keep up with stuff because I'm a member of the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. My year was 81. So I get really good stuff from them, really current, and it's not very political. It's just how to improve teaching.
Are you still involved in any activities that you have been when you first came to Hastings, or Like anything with your church?
Still a member of First Presbyterian Church, still in the choir. Love that. Love that church. And we have a wonderful new minister. We have a wonderful new president here. Having gone through some rough times both places, as you probably heard. Yeah. And Travis Fazell's mother taught in our teacher ed department, and she was terrific. So he's a honeymoon with me, but I think he's great. But he has a lot of hard work to do. Yeah. So, cycles. Maybe that's something you could get from an old gray beard for your notes. How things go in cycles, and if there's some tough times, there'll be a new day dawning.
Mm-hmm.
How about that?
And then lastly, what role has religion played throughout your life?
Well, and you could tell from my mom and dad, and as a preacher's kid and all that. Yeah, all of it. And I don't have all the answers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm perfectly willing to sit and debate about just about anything. I try to understand why somebody would think a gay person is living in sin. I don't get that yet, but I would try to listen. But you can interpret the Bible in different ways, and you have the historical context and the translations. So I'm still trying to figure it out. It's a journey. Life is a journey. Lifetime learner, still reading, I don't know, a book a week or something like that. Lifetime learner, that's what Hastings College and parents who were lifetime learners. And my two aunts, so there were the three daughters, my mom was the only one who married, but the two aunts who gave me Hemingway. Yeah.
For a final thought, what have you seen, like, from the 60s to now, Hastings as a college campus?
Oh, yeah.
What would you say you have seen change throughout the community as a whole?
The college community?
Yes.
Okay. Number one, good change is service.
Mm-hmm.
An orientation toward others and service. Very, very powerful. I think one of the best I've ever seen. A physical change. The physical plant has doubled. That whole part east of what used to be 9th Street was a golf course, the Elks Golf Course.
Oh, wow.
And then Fur Hall was built there, and then the Student Union in Weir Hall. And I lived in Weir Hall for 2 years. And then lived off campus with faculty while they built Bronk Hall, and then lived in Bronk Hall my senior year. So physically, the plan has changed. Thirdly, a lot of care for the landscape of this campus from the very beginning. When they broke ground for McCormick Hall, April 25th, 1883, they planted trees. They came in their Sunday best. Somebody even lost a fur cape because it was in the paper. I saw it in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone found a fur cape from the Hastings College tree planting this past weekend, let me know. And they planted hundreds of trees, and they've been planting trees ever since. And then I've gotten help the last 10 years. The tree post was an Eagle Scout project that I supervised, and we've planted 300 trees, students and I, the student nursery. That's two positives. I've seen us go through, financial ups and downs, and it's a very challenging time for big universities and small colleges. I believe in liberal arts colleges because it prepares you for a lifetime of service, figuring out how to serve and then serve. I hope my grandson, who was in the all-state band, I hope he comes here. His mom and dad and his grandparents came here, but I don't know. Oh, I think there are a lot more support services, tons more. All the computer stuff, the tech stuff, support people. job search, different cultural groups, groups with special, counselors, because my daughter Sarah, who went here, was a mental health professional. She's changed careers a little bit. So more, I'd say a lot more support. And that's one of the reasons that it's more expensive now. But would anyone go to a campus without any trees and without a counselor and without computers? Yeah. And Title IX. Oh, big change for Hastings College. All in way more athletic teams. What did we have? When I was here, we had football, basketball, and track. Period. Then we, somewhere along the line, got baseball, and then with Title IX, we got softball and volleyball and women's track, and now soccer. So you don't see very many faculty at all the different matches. And part of that is you can't go to all of them. I can't, and I'm old-fashioned and still want to go and support the teams. Travis Fizzell says he gets to 3 or 4 a week, but he can't get to all of them. He has some evening obligations. That's a big change, and a good change. I love athletes. I love people who come here because they want to participate. Who come here because they want to be with professors who you can interact with and do special projects like you're doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
You have helped me think about this at my age.